Are you asked to talk about something in particular when you do a talk about your writings on American Buddhism, or do you kind of get to choose what you talk about when you show up to some place?
Both, usually folks will, it's actually nice having the book now because people will ask me to talk about the book, which is nice. Depending on the venue, sometimes people are like, "Oh, talk about Buddhism in America." And it's like, well, okay.
Yeah. Multiple books I've written.
Yeah.
That's how big of a topic it is.
Yeah.
Uh, is there something that you like to kind of go in depth on when you're speaking rather than writing, or is it kind of usually match your writing taste with your lecturing taste?
It's always contextual. I mean, different, I always try to, be attentive to where I'm speaking and what that particular audience or community is like. Um, like the Dharma Bums, here's an eclectic, pan-Buddhist association, you know, they're going to want to hear a particular kind of thing. I do a conference, I'll do the hyper-specific academic thing, So I think it really just depends.
Depends on where
Yeah.
yeah, where you're speaking. And when you started to study American Buddhism, what kind of drew you into that category of research field versus any other particular aspect of Buddhism in general? Was there something that drew you in specifically?
Um, yes and no. I mean, when I first went to grad school, my very first semester, I took a course on Buddhism in the West. That just sort of piqued my interest. And that was also when I was first exposed to Jodo Shinshu and the Buddhist churches of America and the larger history of the Japanese American experience. And so all those things sort of came together at the same time uh, and led me down that path.
Oh, wow. So as you're kind of studying the Japanese American experience in Buddhism within the you said like a graduate studies field, or was it the
Yeah.
your
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah you also kind of maybe started your entry point into Jodo Shinshu for yourself as a practitioner too?
Mhm.
Oh, wow. Uh, was it a teacher moment that kind of opened it up for you, or was it something that you read that kind of made you feel like I want to kind of incorporate this into my life?
Um, well, that's a long story.
Well, we've got time. So as long as you have time.
No, I mean, I think, well, I mean, part of it has to do with just how I ended up in grad school in the first place, um, which was, I got my undergraduate degree in philosophy and religion. And, what do you do with a degree in philosophy?
Think about
Yeah,
it.
you go to grad school. Um, and when I decided and when I decided to go to grad school, I did so because I decided that I wanted to teach at a college and write books and do all that kind of stuff. But I didn't come from an academic background. Like my family background is not is not from the world of academia. So when I first had this idea that I should go to grad school, I had no idea really what that meant, or what it would mean to pursue the academic study of anything really. So I went to see my undergraduate advisor at San Francisco State because I knew, I needed to apply to grad school, to grad programs and get letters of recommendation, all that kind of stuff. And he was like, "Oh, okay, where are you thinking about applying to?" And I'm like, "Here and here." And he's like, "Oh, that's a good place. You shouldn't go to that place." And then he said, "Have you considered the Graduate Theological Union?" And I think he suggested this because one of the interests I had in my undergrad program was in Buddhist Christian dialogue and interreligious studies. Um, and the GTU is really all about interreligious uh, programs and whatnot. Um, I'm pretty sure that my undergraduate advisor wanted me to go to a program where one of his colleagues taught at one of the other GTU member schools. Um, but I'm a little slow sometimes, so I wasn't really picking up on that. And I went, back home and hopped on my roommate's computer, the one that was connected to the internet, because that's what we did back then. And went online and found the GTU and found that they had a program affiliation with the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And thought, oh, that must be what my professor was talking about. I'll just apply to that school.
Wow.
I had no prior exposure to Jodo Shinshu. I think I knew as much as any normal person who goes to public school knows about the Japanese American experience. And so it was really an eye-opening experience the first time I came to the Institute, and just felt like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be.
Wow. Uh, it's so funny that you thought that you were kind of going along with what your advisor was telling you. And have you checked in with them since you kind of pursued your path?
I ran into him at a reception or something a couple of years into my grad program, and he's like, "Oh, you're at IBS now," and looked kind of disappointed.
It's like, yeah, that's not. I was. You saw me winking. Didn't you see me do all the different? I had wrote it on signs.
That's
Uh,
okay. I've made my peace with that, and
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you clearly, you're very much established, and it seems like you're very much thriving here. I actually meant to bring that up before we get back to your path, but you're now the president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies.
well, in another 10 days. But
Uh,
yes,
okay. You are the soon to be
for
the
all intents and purposes, yeah.
yes, in 10 days. And well, congratulations. I know this is early, but congratulations all the same. And I was curious, like with your new position, do you get like some sort of Air Force One kind of thing? Do you get like your own kind of special thing that you get to wield? Anything like that?
No.
Okay. Did and I will get back to the your kind of experiences at IBS as a student, but has your involvement in a academic leadership position at a Jodo Shinshu affiliated institution, has that done anything for your practice, or does it feel like you're participating in a way that feels fulfilling in that regard at all?
The longer I'm here, the older I get, the more I recognize that, in a very real sense, my work at the Institute and my work as a scholar really is my practice. I don't see that as necessarily a separate thing. Luckily, it pays the bills.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, but being in Buddhist spaces, people will often ask you, what's your practice? And usually what they mean is, do you meditate and, all that, or chanting, or, sometimes people are like, oh, you must be a vegetarian, or whatever the case might be. And I don't do any of
Yeah.
that.
But when you show up like fully yourself, and you show up for your work in every capacity to like to address the concerns of the office or concerns of your departments and all those things with that kind of philosophy supporting you, basically. Is that right?
Well, part of it is this, that I feel as though there's a tendency to think about practice as being a sort of a limited number of behaviors, right? People tend to think of practice as the sort of explicit, rituals or meditation or whatever the case might be, depending on your Buddhist tradition. And I find that to be a particularly narrow definition or narrow understanding of what practice means, and kind of out of step with um, sort of fully living a Buddhist or a religious life more generally.
Yeah.
Uh, if I thought about it long enough, I would probably say this is one among many Protestant biases that we have in the modern West about what religion is supposed to look like. There's that pejorative thing Christians will say about, oh, you're only a Christian on Easter or something, right? Like the sort of denigrate the Christians who only go to church on major holidays. Um, you know, and that sort of implies that there's a right way to be religious, or to be a practitioner, and that some practices are better or worse than others, or more authentic or than others. And I think that the problem there is that you end up, those sort of hierarchies of evaluating different, ways of being almost always get bound up with other biases we have, right? So if you think about, in Buddhism, who's more likely to be the kind of person who, you sort of comes to mind when you think about a meditating, practitioner? Usually it's a monk, which means usually it's a man.
Mm,
Right. And so I think that there's a way in which the way in which we sort of assume that the right way to be Buddhist tends to be gendered male. And then all of the stuff that men do tends to be more highly valued than the stuff that women are typically, are doing within the communities. And so that's where I start to feel like, well, here's the deal. When you're talking about the religious life of the whole community, there's all different kinds of people, and they're all doing different kinds of things in service of that community and in service of the Dharma. Let's not worry about, which kinds of practices are better or worse, right?
right.
Uh, so I know, for example, I've had lots of conversations with folks here in Jodo Shinshu, circles here in California. There's always a guy who is the gardener, right? The guy who shows up. He never goes to temple on Sunday. He never goes to the services. Will say, quite frankly, he doesn't understand anything about Buddhism, but for some reason he shows up every day and like pulls the weeds and makes sure that the paint is nice and so on and so forth. You know, that to me is practice. And that to me is just as valuable as whatever the priest is doing, during the rituals or whatever, because without the gardener,
The space wouldn't look the way it does, and
place falls apart. Yeah.
right, right. Wow. And yeah, I think that that's a really uh I mean, it's hard to comment on it necessarily because it's all intertwined, and to comment on one part of it or one aspect would be to try to pick it apart. But like the general approach feels or appears to be and feels like it is a complete life, uh a way of moving through life basically, and however you go about your life is how you go about your service to the community.
Yeah, yeah.
And uh, did
I mean, I
you
don't
find
I don't think it's just like lip service, right? Like there's that whole, um people who don't like religion will often say, Buddhism isn't a religion, it's a way of life. Which I disagree with. Buddhist, I happen to think that Buddhism fits the definition of religion, but even if you take that seriously, that Buddhism is a way of life, then that means it's how you live. It's not, how you spend Sunday morning.
right, right, interesting. So like the I guess like so what for you what makes the definition of religion applicable to Buddhism is just the general like philosophical framework and like the different expressions, or what, or how does that square with you, like
Well,
where they're
religion
both
is a made up category.
right.
It really is. It's a category of thing of a social phenomenon that scholars came up with in order to organize the world. To me, it has the same, it functions in the same way as the category mammal, right?
Right,
There's no platonic ideal of what makes something a mammal. It's something that biologists are like, oh, mammals have fur and they give birth to live young.
right,
They just sort of decided that that's how they're going to classify a certain kind of animal, and then they find a platypus and they're like,
exactly,
well,
yeah. Yeah,
no,
but yeah,
it mostly fits.
yeah, yeah,
And
uh
so similarly, scholars come up with this category of religion, and religions are things that have, cosmologies, ethics, or moral framework, explain the nature of reality, explain what humans purpose is within that system of reality have some sort of social aspect and rituals. Buddhism has all of those things.
Gotcha.
So does that mean that it's somehow like special or unique or whatever? No, that's a category that scholars came up with in order to describe the world. And then we debate what that means. The other reason why I think this is important is mostly a sort of political or legal argument. Not only is religion a social, a scholarly convention or category that we just sort of made up and could be changed, but it's also directly tied into legal frameworks around the world and therefore gets politicized in very specific ways. So I often will glibly say, if you don't think Buddhism should be a religion, that's fine. Be prepared to start paying taxes,
Right.
right?
For your spaces and for everything. And yeah.
And maybe religion should pay taxes, right? And in fact, just today I saw a news story that Louisiana has voted to require that all classrooms have a copy of the Ten Commandments in them or something, right? So there's all of these issues about the separation of church and state and so on and so forth. These aren't settled issues, but to just sort of say, oh, well, Buddhism isn't a religion, therefore it ignores that sort of that social political reality that we live in, and I think has other kinds of consequences that people should be aware of.
So both, there is a, I guess, worldly or three-dimensional important purpose of recognizing Buddhism as an organization, as a religious organization, or a tradition at least. And then, but there's also this very important piece where, how that is expressed doesn't necessarily have to have a hierarchy
Yeah,
of importance, and nor does it necessarily need to have strict stipulations as to how it's
yeah.
approached or lived.
Yeah,
And
I've had this conversation with my students. Most of the things that we sort of take for granted as real really aren't. Most of the things we take for granted as real are just social conventions. But that doesn't mean they're not important, right? That doesn't mean they don't have consequences. I think about Pluto, right? Like Pluto, when I was growing up, was a planet.
yeah, oh yeah,
We had 9 planets.
yes, yes,
And then, some agency came along and they're like, no, we're going to change the definition of planet. That doesn't have any effect on Pluto, right? Pluto is just a rock.
with lower self-esteem now, but yes, it's a yeah,
You know,
yeah,
Pluto doesn't know, doesn't care, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, but that doesn't change the fact that, yeah, people get really worked up about this, right? People get really attached to the idea of what is a planet, and they get pissed off that, Neil deGrasse Tyson made Pluto no longer a planet, even though he didn't,
yeah, yeah,
they get really wound up about that kind of stuff. So even though a category is sort of made up, doesn't mean it doesn't have consequences or effects in our everyday experience. And the same thing is true for religion, for race, for gender, for all of the other social constructs that we have that we think are natural and sort of fixed in stone when they're really not,
yeah,
still affect us. And the same is true with religion and practice. And a lot of it, again, has to do with that, like you said, that sort of hierarchy of value judgments and the way it's easy for us to be like, oh, you're not really doing the thing
yeah.
because I
Did
have this category in my head.
Yeah. And so when you were pursuing Institute of Buddhist Studies as a student, walking in the door and starting to take classes and everything like that, was this kind of where you started to appreciate Buddhism in the way that we're talking about it now, where there's this more open and almost like I don't know if the right word is like liberated sense of just kind of how it can really be anything. It can really be expressed in all different kind of ways, and everyone participates the way that they participate and all that. Was that something that you kind of experienced or was introduced to as soon as you walked in the door, or was this something that you had before you came to IBS or after you graduated kind of thing?
No, this is definitely the end result of many, many years of reflecting on these things and study and whatnot. When I before I went to grad school, when I was an undergraduate and even back into high school, I was always, for a variety of reasons, just really curious about different philosophies and religions. And during college, I was definitely shopping around trying to find different communities or practices that would make sense. And I think I very much had that idea in my head that, Buddhists meditate or Buddhists do this, or, you have to have a thing that sort of defines your perspective. Um, and even when I first became interested on a personal level in Jodo Shinshu, not just as an academic thing, but more personally, even then I would often feel like, I'm not doing it right. I don't, I'm not going to temple, I'm not participating. And there's also, that whole level of, the more you learn about Buddhism, there's things about Buddhist history and philosophy and thought that are amazing and wonderful and beautiful. And there's also stuff that's like, I'm not so sure about that. And so then that sort of creates that sense of doubt. Um, but over the years, the more I've pursued my academic interests, this all of this stuff about, what constitutes real practice or authentic practice, this is definitely part of my academic journey, so to speak, which certainly influences the way I think about Buddhism and my own practice.
Yeah.
And I would say it's, there's a lovely thing that Chensing Han says in her book, Be the Refuge. I think she's quoting one of her interviewees who's talking about this idea of conversion. And again, this is a Protestant bias. Conversion is something that happens at a particular moment. You make that decision. Now you are a Christian. And in Chensing Han's book, she talks about how people who have come to Buddhism later in life don't feel like they've converted as much as they use the analogy of a tea bag steeping
Yeah.
tea. It's like you put the tea bag in the water, it's water, and then at some point it becomes tea. But at what point does that happen, right? Like when does water turn into tea? Like how much?
Yeah.
Which I think is a really great metaphor.
And it's also up to personal preference, right? Like I happen to like my tea well steeped, for a while, but I want to get the full flavor. But some people like a little touch of the whatever it is. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really I like that analogy, and I appreciate you bringing a lot of attention to the Protestant bias and with the conversion rhetoric, and also just like in general, like the ideas of practice as being it's got to be a certain way, it's got to be a certain something. Um, and I remember in a class at IBS, we talked about how the notion of practice itself is um, something to be analyzed in its own right, where if you're receiving within a Jodo Shinshu context, if you're receiving kind of this compassion and grace from Amida Buddha, like what is it that you're doing? If uh, the gratitude or the anything that you're doing in service or of service to the community, if that's all coming from Amida Buddha, then what exactly are you doing? How could you be doing anything? Has that resonated with you at all as you kind of went and became closer into this community?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting, and I would almost say radical ideas that Shinran uh, advances in his work. And this is like one of those great sort of ongoing theological, so to speak, debates or conversations within, the sort of uh, rarefied world of hardcore nerds who really geek out on all the finer points of doctrine. But yeah, I mean, basically, Shinran is saying, because of our karmic limitations, we're incapable of doing a certain kind of practice. And yet, there's this whole mythology around Amida Buddha, which basically says it doesn't matter your karmic hindrances, just rely on me, and through my own karmic power, you're gonna reach nirvana. Um, what I see that as is really sort of the logical conclusion of the whole idea of no self, and a sort of radical undermining of this whole idea of um, you know uh, the self that can somehow propel itself into a state of non-selfness, if you will. I'm
Right.
not sure if I'm explaining that correctly, but I mean, a fundamental part, particularly of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, is this idea that there is no distinction between self and other. If you take that seriously, then yes, it's that question of who's actually doing the practice. If there is no such thing as a self, then am I actually doing anything? And how do you get to that point? Um, you know, to a deep awareness of that.
And then if I'm not, am I doing anything, or is everything I'm doing a part of the experience of what Amitabha is sending to me, or is otherwise is practice in that sense?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
the true suchness of the universe, or the Buddha nature of the universe, or the ground of reality, or whatever the particular tradition is talking about. However they phrase it. I mean, if we're all interconnected in some way, where is that distinction between, where do I end and you begin?
Right. Right. And have you as a part of like your research fields, because I know that you research a lot within American culture and religious culture. Has your curiosities taken you all over the world for Jodo Shinshu related or Buddhist related
Mhm.
study and just understanding of how people approach their uh, their traditions and all that? I mean, have you been kind of all over the place for that?
Not literally, no.
Okay.
Um, but one of the things about Buddhism in America is that virtually every kind of Buddhism that exists in Asia has some sort of presence in America. And so, when I wrote my first book on the textbook on Buddhism in America, to do that kind of survey, you kind of, I had to do a bit of research to
Yeah.
make sure I understood, the not just the fundamentals of different traditions, but also their histories. And so that really gets into that question about going all over the world, right? I mean, the reasons why there are so many different types of Buddhisms in the United States has everything to do with, everything from colonialism to the Cold War to globalization. You know, pick any tradition, and you're not just talking about, oh, there's a community in South Dakota that is there. It's like, well, it's there because of the war in Vietnam. And so now you have to talk about that, right? So you end up talking about sort of global history and global politics in order to explain where we're at the present moment. Which definitely then, it's like, I remember doing research for that book and just, discovering parts of world history that I had no idea about, which aren't directly relevant, but just because you fall down that rabbit hole and you're like, oh,
Yeah. And just keep digging. You're like, wait a minute. Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah. Has your research, especially for Buddhism in America, that book, did that take you to different parts of America? Did you physically have to go to different states that you'd never been to for any other reason?
No.
No. Okay. You could do a lot from just the computer, or just a lot from.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I should say yes to that, otherwise, when I sound like a fraud. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of research that's been done in different parts of the country. I remember before I wrote that book, I had some ideas for other. Uh, I had ideas for a project about Buddhist music, particularly in the BCA, and I realized that the only way that I would be able to really to do that research right, I would either need to have a horde of grad students that I could send out across the country, or get some sort of sizable research grant myself and spend a couple of years actually traveling around the country to really dig deep.
This could be your Air Force One. This could be you can get an RV and
Maybe I could, yeah, yeah, yeah.
just
Get
travel. This sounds fun. I'd be into this. I think well that entry point music within the BCA context sounds really fascinating, because I remember it's a very relatively superficial knowledge that I have of it, but they are like gata, is that right? The gatas,
Mhm.
or is that, yeah? And those are songs that are sung in service, or like during a service. And have you found anything in particular that you'd want to dive deep within that category?
Yeah, I did some research on this. I have an article or two published on that. Um, the gathas were definitely very interesting to me. Um, Again, superficially, when I first encounter Jodo Shinshu, you go to a BCA temple or a BCA church, and they start singing songs that sound just like Christian hymns. And what's the deal with that? you know, just as a general question. But it's actually got a really long and interesting history. Um, and in the research that I did, it connects not just to um, sort of the acculturation of Buddhist practice in the first part of the 20th century in America, but it also then dovetails with sort of Buddhist artistic expression more generally, because a lot of the folks who are working in who are doing Buddhist music, they might also be doing taiko or gagaku, which is a form of sort of like traditional Japanese court music that has a Buddhist spin to it. Um, Traditional Japanese music, with the shamisen and other instruments like that. But then also, there's Buddhist jazz musicians, and so there's all these ways in which people are doing artistic, creative things, very explicitly in a Buddhist context, either, during a service or within the temple or sort of adjacent to that. Which is just really, it's just really interesting. Again, it gets to that question of what do you mean by practice? And, if somebody's, playing taiko in a Buddhist taiko group at a Buddhist temple, you know, and they're doing something that's Buddhist, right? It's not meditation per se, or it might not even be as consciously Buddhist as somebody who's, the hardcore meditator or whatnot. But it's all in there, and I think it's worth exploring. It's worth doing some research on.
Yeah, and it brings that personal, I guess, expressiveness to it, and individual on an individual basis, where um, no, I don't have a good knowledge of this specific uh, traditional Japanese instrument. However, I can really nail a drum kit, and I can really go for it, and so I can play certain music that would be expressive for me of my uh, commitment or my interest in Jodo Shinshu, but it's not going to sound like something that you'd find 100 or a couple hundred years ago. And and like what we're talking about, there's like a validity to all of that expression.
Mhm.
um and as a musician, I understand that you know your way around a drum kit, right? Do you and has that ever has I don't know what the way to term it would be, but like, is there a Jodo Shinshu element that you kind of bring in that has like playing at a service kind of thing? Would you ever want to do that with your musical ability?
Um, I've never seen a full rock band at a BCA service, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. I don't, and I was into being a musician more first before I was ever interested in Buddhism. The first time I started playing drums was at in a garage punk band when I was in junior high school. So, um, not really Buddhist per se.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I got back into it as an adult, mostly because it was like a midlife crisis, and um, you know, that was a better use of my time than having an affair or getting a sports car.
Corvette, or yeah.
But I have had conversations with, like, Harry Bridge, who also teaches here at IBS. He's a musician too. He's a bassist, and there's definitely, whenever you're engaged in a creative and particularly a physical act, whether it's, music or exercise or dance or whatever else, there's definitely a time when you can sort of drop into your body and sort of no longer be in a certain level of consciousness. This is probably true for most people. It's certainly true for me. I feel like I live most of my life, up here in my head, thinking about things and, so on and so forth. And I think arguably one of the goals of Buddhist practice is to, be aware of that and then sort of go beyond that. And there's something about, uh, being in that almost like trance state where you're fully embodied, but not, just fully, driven by your consciousness. which was a great place to be when you're
Yeah.
playing music.
I don't have a whole lot of experience. I've always wanted to play the drums, but I never, just for various reasons. I grew up in an apartment, and just having a smashing snare drum and of all the hi-hats and all that kind of stuff just wouldn't have worked out. But I uh I used to play the guitar and various things like that. However, there's something that I really admire about drummers in particular, is that they keep the rhythm, and they really have to focus and drop into something, I don't know if it's another state, but they just have to drop into a level of focus that's very deep and very consistent. And do you find that when you keep the rhythm, and when you're kind of playing the drums, that you kind of drop into that
Yeah, I mean,
space?
there's like it's the groove.
Yeah.
And there's a very special place between you know, yeah, like very intentionally keeping the beat and knowing that you're following the music and you know, doing what you're supposed to be doing, where you are very aware of all of that. And then the sort of opposite space where you're not really paying attention at all, and then you lose the beat and you know, totally screw up.
Yeah.
And there's a place right in between, which is, you know, that place where you're no longer thinking like, okay, I'm playing and I have to be, this is what I'm doing, and you know, you just sort of, you know, fall into it. um yeah. You know, I can't think of the right word, but I've heard lots of other musicians, and again, like athletes or dancers or other people, who will talk about that state.
Like flow or something,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Uh, are
Have you
there
ever seen the
drum?
movie, the Pixar movie, Soul?
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's a whole thing in that movie about souls getting lost in the flow state or something like that,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
which is, you know, that's a really interesting movie.
yeah.
It didn't it didn't get a lot of good press for whatever reason, um,
No.
but that flow state I think is really well done in that movie, of like this place where people go and they're just in the moment and not sort of distracted by their bodies or their minds.
Yeah. I'll have to watch that again, because I think I watched it as soon as it was available on like a digital thing, and it
Mhm.
was during 2020, so all kinds of things were
Yeah,
flying right
right.
by me.
Everything was horrible.
Yeah. But I remember really enjoying that movie a lot, so I'll have to pick that back up. But something
And,
that I've been noticing.
and
Okay.
I'll say just as an aside that, when they were putting that movie together, they actually reached out to former IBS faculty member Dijaku Kinst, as a consultant, and her name is in the credits.
No way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow. As someone that uh could contribute to even like a music theory as well, or just within the philosophical.
The philosophical, I think there's like a section of the credits that says like spiritual advisors or something.
Wow. Wow,
So,
what a
you know,
role.
yeah, this is a movie about, you know, death and the afterlife. So they, you know, they did their due
Wow.
diligence and reached out to people. Yeah.
And I really do appreciate that about Pixar. I grew up in San Francisco, and I've heard that there are so many references, or also just so many elements of the Bay Area that are in those movies, and not just in Finding Nemo with Monterey Bay and all that kind of stuff. It's just like there are just so many other little things there that are more than just uh, what is it, Easter eggs? You know,
Yeah, yeah.
they're really celebrated. But that's an awesome thing to think about, that, especially the next time I try to revisit that movie. Are there drummers for you that you looked up to when you were younger, or ones that you are into right now, or are you just kind of just more generally into music, and just that's it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more generally into music. I mean, there's definitely some drum channels or artists that I follow online, that do some crazy stuff. You know, I'm of a particular age. I grew up on, you know, Red Hot Chili Peppers,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
lots of punk and heavy metal. Um, but somebody came to mind and then they put it away. So
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I have appreciated specifically stoner metal
Mhm.
within the past few years. I don't know a whole lot about it. I just kind of have like dipped my toe into it. But metal music in general, the amount of strength and
Yeah.
endurance that those drummers have to have, and how interesting their signatures become, or
Mhm.
how interesting their th- all of a sudden they'll be like going like lightning fast, and they'll have to slow down for a more of like a sweeping guitar break or whatever it is. It's so complicated, and you
Yeah.
really got to be dialed in.
Yeah. Yeah. I never took lessons when I was a kid. Like I said, I was in a series of increasingly bad garage bands. So it was just sort of, self-taught and put the headphones on and like, okay, we'll cover this song. What the hell? And then when I got back into it, I started taking lessons, and that was a really interesting experience because then I revisited music that I, had never really paid that much attention to, or, maybe I thought it was too hard or whatever the case might be, and then discovered some of this deeper layer of musicality. John Bonham, for example, the drummer for Led Zeppelin,
Oh,
um, his stuff is crazy, and a lot of it is because a lot of musicians of his generation got into rock and roll via the blues and jazz music, and so a lot of his formal training was actually more like in the blues and sort of the blues time signatures, but also jazz music. And that's like, oh, like that's a whole different level of musicality that you don't really think about when you're just listening to the heavy guitar riffs or whatever else. And it's like, oh, there's something else going on here.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
The front people, or like the guitarists that are just kind of like on their knees shredding and all that, they take a lot of the focus, they take a lot of the eyes, but the drummers are really like doing a whole lot to support the whole vessel of everything. Um, do you find that jazz elements, improvisational elements come into your musical approach, like whenever you practice, or like practice the drums or
I,
whatever?
I wish I could be a jazz drummer, but I'm not.
Yeah, yeah. Do- is that like a learned openness kind of skill thing, or is that something that like you feel like there are certain people that are more adept at kind of picking that up?
Well, I feel like I'm a decent drummer, and if you give me a song, I can figure it out and break it down and learn it. I don't know if I'm a musician.
Hmm.
And I feel like to be a jazz musician, particularly with the improvisation and all that kind of stuff, you kind of have to be a musician. And the way I think of it is, um, it's sort of like cooking. Like I'm a good cook. I do most of the cooking at home, for example, but that's mostly because I'm good at following directions. And we'll have the recipe, and like if the recipe says to do this, I'll do this, and it'll taste good. Um, but that's different from being a chef. And I think a chef is the kind of person who can, look at a bunch of ingredients in their pantry and be like, oh, this will taste good together. I don't have that concept, right? Of like, if I do this to this vegetable, or if I add this spice to this spice or whatever, it'll taste good. Like if I tried to do that, I'm sure it would be a disaster.
Yeah,
Similarly with music, I don't think I've quite gotten to that point where I can pick up an instrument and like come up with a melody or come up with um sort of something more musical without some assistance in some way.
yeah, yeah. I'm very similar, especially when it comes to being in the kitchen. I think that I could do well. I don't do a whole lot of it, but I could do very well with baking, because it's just kind of like, it's this. If you mess this up, if it's not salt, it's sugar, and if you put the sugar, if you put the salt in, it's not good. Yeah, so I kind of get the rule basis thing down, but like some chefs, they need to have the creative element to it,
Yeah.
so some chefs can't be good bakers as a result. I mean, not everyone, but um and then too, like for your writing, because you write in a scholarly way, and you have to do certain things where you are writing about things that need footnotes and
Mhm.
things that need to have some sort of vetting in it. Do you find that you can reach a state of flow with your writing and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. And writing is a different process. I mean, I think that there's um Well, for me anyway, a lot of the writing that I do, definitely that sense of flow comes in like the first draft or something. Just to get my ideas down, I will often just write, kind of without distraction. And then when I go back is when I go back and find, the places where I need to have footnotes. Uh, and we'll, and honestly, we'll sometimes do more research, and that first draft, ends up being mostly completely rewritten. A lot of my first drafts will have, some really good, narrative parts, or some really good, well constructed sentences and so on and so forth. And then, brackets that says, I think so and so said this about this. Come back to it later. And then I'll go find so and so and be like, oh no, I totally misremembered that. So
I
this whole thing has to be totally changed.
well, it's good that you leave a little breadcrumb though for yourself to kind of go
Yeah,
back and take a look at it.
yeah.
Is there something about as you approach, because you, I feel like you're writing all the time and you're always kind of preparing, you're always kind of invested in the field somewhere. Is there an element right now of Buddhism in America or otherwise another topic that you are interested in diving into in the future, or that you are now that you're kind of excited about uncovering other outside of the Buddhism and music within the BCA community?
No.
Okay. That's taking a lot of your time. Yeah.
Well, the last book that I wrote was The Making of American Buddhism that came out last summer. And, I invested a lot of, you know, I was just telling somebody the other day, I feel like, there are things in that book that I've been trying to say for the last 25 years. So, it's one of those books where um, most of what I've been trying to do as a scholar is really in that book. Um,
Wow.
so, uh, on the one hand, it's a little scary to say I don't know if I have any other ideas. But on the other hand, I've also been, I wrote that book very, very intentionally and very specifically for an audience of academics. I hope that, that normal people can read it and enjoy it and get something out of it. But I was very, very clear on the fact that, this is an academic book for academics, and there's definitely a part of me that feels like I'd be interested in doing other kinds of work. Um, that there's other audiences out there that don't want to look at footnotes. And I'd be interested in doing writing in a different vein. There's another scholar named Vanessa Sasson, who I think she's up in Toronto or Calgary or one of those places. Um, she brilliant scholar. And she's now written two novels. The first one was a sort of novelization of the Buddha's wife before he left and became the Buddha. And then she has another newer novel out that's about the first community of Buddhist nuns. And I'll be honest, I haven't read either of these novels, but just the idea of, you know, using your scholarly acumen to write a novel is really intriguing to me. Because that's a whole different kind um, of writing, So
Yeah. Yeah, it's an entirely different kind of skill set. Yet, people do research for the novels for sure. It would
absolutely,
depending on the thing that they're writing about. It could just be their life or something like that. But how cool is that? So, have you ever are you a fan of novels yourself, or are you a fan of kind of general fiction, historical
I've got a very
fiction?
large stack of books on my nightstand that
Yeah, just stays together and yeah. Well, so you are thinking about maybe kind of having a more creative writing element that is a little bit more uh that reaches people beyond the academic circuit.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Would it be about the Japanese American Buddhist experience in particular, or would it be about any kind of uh any other topic
I
or
don't really have any
subject?
ideas right now, so
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh
I don't I don't know if I would necessarily write about the Japanese American experience. I feel like I can do that as an academic. I wouldn't want to do it as a novelist.
right, right,
That
right.
would be strange.
Well, that is, I mean, that is a very, I do hope that you do jump on that because it is such an interesting art form that takes a lot of skill, a lot of patience, a lot of endurance to even
Yeah.
just begin on. But that's really cool. I and then I understand that you also as far you are very dynamic in all of your interests, for particularly artistic interests, because I understand that you have creative writing and you have academic writing, you have music backgrounds, and then I think you also have some ink too, right? You have some like tattoo art and things like that. Is
Yeah.
that something that you go out and like kind of see within a or like are interested in within a Buddhist context as well? Like would you want to study Buddhist tattoo art or things like that out in the world?
Um, I don't know if I want to study it or not. And I, I was interested in the question of Buddhist tattoos, quite a while ago. I reached a certain age not too long ago where some of these things feel like the pursuits of a younger person. I'm definitely reaching that point in my life.
Yeah.
But the idea of Buddhist tattoos are interesting to me from a sort of global perspective. I don't know if you know or not, but several years ago, and by several, I mean probably 10 or 15 years ago, there were a couple of well-known cases of American or European tourists in places like Sri Lanka or Thailand who got in trouble with the local authorities for having visible tattoos, and in particular tattoos of Buddhist iconography, and they were considered sacrilegious, basically. And in one case, I think a woman got deported for having a tattoo of a Buddha image on her arm or something.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm I'm curious about, like, as a cultural practice, you know, things we sort of again take for granted, right? Like in when I was growing up, when I got my first tattoo, way too young, you know, I think I gave my mom a heart attack. Right? Because it was long enough ago. The only people who had tattoos were, biker dudes and criminals,
Sailors and yeah, yeah,
or you're in the Navy or something.
yeah.
And now they're pretty common, right? Um,
Oh yeah.
but that's not true everywhere, right? There's still a sort of bias against tattoos in Japan, for example. In Buddhist majority countries, and you have to be careful about, what kind of tattoos you have. So as a cultural practice, I find that really interesting. Uh,
Yeah.
in part because it's also, yeah, it's an expression, right? People get tattoos because they want to express something about who they are, or what they care about. So, does that become like a religious practice, that kind of thing? Because it's
Yeah.
that's really not limited to Buddhism, obviously. So
And then there's like a reminder element too. You can see it and be like, oh yeah, that's right. Like this is something that I'm committed to, or at least I did commit to.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
But then you
Is
got to
it
be careful if you travel internationally. So,
right? Yeah. I do sometimes. I don't know why. I feel like this is like maybe my new dadness, but I do think about Post Malone running around the world and having all those tattoos on his face and just being like, some people they're not gonna understand Post. They're just
yeah,
not gonna
yeah,
understand.
yeah. We had that exact same conversation at home not too long ago. You get a tattoo on your face, you've committed to a particular way of being in the world, and that's fine.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You just have to accept that you might not, if you
yeah,
decide later on in life to become, an investment banker, you might not get that job.
yeah. That's true. But then again, they are so common now. Like there was a time when face tattoos only meant a very specific thing. Now it could mean that you're cool, like that you're like,
Again, I think I've reached that point where I'm a little bit too old, and I'm like,
yeah.
ah.
Yeah. So for these for the Japan and I think you said Sri Lanka and some other countries where there are Buddhist iconography on your arms, not necessarily doing anything uh vulgar or sacrilegious in its own depiction, but just the very fact that it's tattooed
Yeah.
on your arm, that is enough to say no thank you. We'd rather you
Yeah, I
not.
mean, some of it has to do with practices around images of Buddhas. Like, in some Buddhist traditions, you're not even supposed to get a statue of the Buddha wet. And so if you have an image of the Buddha on your arm, how are you going to take a shower?
Right. Wow.
But on the other hand, my response to that is usually, well, in order for an image of the Buddha to be, ritually powerful, so to speak, you have to go through the eye-opening ritual. There's an actual specific consecration ritual that happens. So if you don't do that, then it's a lifeless image. Um, but who am I to say that the government of Sri Lanka is wrong? They can decide whatever they want to do. Uh,
Yeah.
but in Japan, I think most of the concern about tattoos from an older generation was that only criminals ever got tattoos, and so if you got a tattoo, then that was like a surefire way to never get a job. It didn't matter what kind of whether it was a Buddhist tattoo or not. Any tattoo is sort of verboten. I hear that's changing, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions, but like, are tattoo artists themselves also on the underground then? If criminals are the only ones that get tattoos, then the tattoo artists have to kind of be like, they're not like in New York City, you walk down the street, there's a tattoo parlor somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like in Tokyo, that might not be the case. It has to be kind of
That's a
more.
good question. I haven't really thought about that. Yeah.
Let's go get tattoos and yeah,
Again, I feel like it's changing, so I'm not really sure if that's
yeah.
the case anymore. But
And why can't an image or a Buddha statue become wet? Why can't they get wet in certain traditions? Is it just
I'm not sure. I think it just has to do with specific cultural practices around what, because I think this came from somebody who is from a Chinese tradition, and I'm not as familiar with that because like in the Japanese tradition, there's the Hanamatsuri service, the celebrates the birth of the Buddha, and part of that is pouring sweet tea over a little statue of the Buddha. So that seems to be okay. Again, I would hesitate to say there's any hard and fast rules, and it's possible that this person who made this comment that's just their own wacky understanding of things, and it's not canonical at all. Um, but just to say that I think that's as a cultural practice, it's interesting to think of here's this thing that we do and sort of take it for granted
yeah.
and don't think about it too much. But then you go somewhere else in the world and it's the exact same thing, but it has a whole different set of meanings. It's similar to how Buddha statues show up as home decor, right? In America, right? You can go to the hardware store and get a little statue of the Buddha for your garden, and
Yeah.
you put it on the ground in your garden without any awareness of the fact that a statue of the Buddha is supposed to be elevated, right? Having it on the floor is deeply offensive to some Buddhist cultures. So it's just sort of an interesting reflection on
Yeah.
how these things change and move over time and across place.
I had one more question before I ask you the last question here. But do you have like an altar space as part of your Jodo Shinshu life? Do you have one in your house, or is that something
I
that
do
is
have a Butsudan. I have a Buddhist altar in my home. I will sadly say it is not as clean or well used as it should be.
yeah. But having something in your house kind of reflecting that something Jodo Shinshu specific in your house is kind of like a part of your,
Yeah.
at least a part of your home, at least is not,
Oh yeah.
whether or not it's something that you do or not. Is that something that you do something with every day, or have like a relationship with at all, or is it mostly it's there and it reminds you of
I definitely have a relationship with it, and it's one I would say is defined in large part by my own sense of guilt that I'm not doing more with it. But that's my own upbringing.
right? Oh yeah, no, yeah, no,
Has very little to do with Buddhism.
yeah. I could feel guilty looking around my house all the time, but it could
And
be the
that's a
unfolded
conversation
laundry.
for my therapist, not for your podcast audience.
Yes. No, I hear you. And then but before we kind of come to a close here, I was curious if you had anything that you would want to share en masse, like a new book that you want to get some eyes on, like something to promote, or a foundation or a cause, or just like something that you would want more ears or eyes to see.
Well, again, my book, The Making of American Buddhism, I really want people to read that.
Great, you got it.
generally speaking, and the Institute of Buddhist Studies. I think that what we're doing at IBS is, really important. And you know, you should give us some money. There's a donate page on our website.
I think we could put that can be a direct pull quote. We can put that right on the website. Is you should give us some money.
Well, I mean, in all
President.
seriousness, IBS, we educate people to become ministers and priests and chaplains, and they go out into the world and they meet people, who are suffering, who are, our students are doing the real work. I'm in awe of what our students go out into the world and do. So I hope that we can keep doing that.
I can attest as a student that there are so many people that I met that I feel very inspired by, and kind of also in awe of, that dedicate their lives to chaplaincy and to taking care of some pretty profound suffering. And
Yeah.
so I'm really grateful for institutions like IBS that get them going and give them the resources that they need to do what they do. So thank you for that, and congratulations again on your presidency and all the wonderful things that you're up to. Well, thank you so much, Scott. I really do appreciate you joining me for the conversation.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye.